U.S. container ports receive a minimum of 2 million units of cargo from China every month. And this figure continues to rise even with supply chain issues. The most common route from China to the east coast of the U.S., where major ports are located, is to cross the Pacific Ocean and then the Panama Canal. It's considered reliable and provides access to most of the major cities. Of course, there are other routes, like going around through the dangerous Drake Passage below South America. Another option is the transatlantic route straight west, through the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. However, both routes aren't very popular because they require way too much money and, more importantly, a lot more precious time. In short, the situation's clear. We've already explained it many times in other videos. But what if I say that there could be another route, maybe even more profitable and convenient than through Panama? And this route might potentially kill off the Panama Canal for good. Hold on a sec, I forgot to make coffee. Here's an unobtrusive reminder to do something at the end of the video if it slips your mind. And I appreciate those who respect my wish to stay anonymous. In 2023, our planet faced one of the biggest and scariest traffic jams. But this jam didn't happen on some highway stuffed with a bunch of cars. It happened right here in the Panama Canal. See for yourself. Each dot on this map is a ship waiting to cross. In 2023, between 100 and 160 ships could be waiting at the same time to move from one ocean to another. Some of them are loaded with containers stuffed with all sorts of items, including furniture, consumer goods, or building materials. Some carry oil or gas, others transport grain. You can say that pretty much anything that can be shipped over long distances for sale passes through the Panama Canal. And by the way, for those who don't know, if you've ever signed a contract that has a clause about force majeure, that's exactly when it comes into play. Kind of. The year 2023 showed that the volumes of this pretty much anything are way too big for the channel. When over 100 ships were lined up at the same time, they had to wait 3 weeks for a chance to get to the other side. 3 weeks! This is a really long time, especially considering that just a little while ago, the same trip took about 8 to 10 hours. Imagine you're going to dash to the nearest store for snacks, and it takes you a few days eventually. The huge lines at the entrance to the channel remained even after some ships started choosing alternative routes. But it doesn't seem like that reduced the delays at all. Economists quickly began talking about how the delay might drive up inflation, particularly in the U.S., not to mention the huge losses suffered by shipping companies whose vessels were crossing the canal. But you know what's the most surprising thing in this whole situation? Well, at least in my view. So despite the huge delays, queues, and financial losses for ship owners, the canal actually raised the tolls for transit. I'm serious. According to some sources, the Panama Canal is jacking up the toll fees by as much as 8 times. On the one hand, it's highway robbery. On the other hand, we're talking about the fastest, or at least the safest, route from one ocean to another. Not that the alternatives are a worthy replacement. But where did this huge queue come from that caused serious damage to the economies of many countries? I did some digging and found out that it appeared right after the restrictions were imposed. Now let me break it down. Take a look. The Panama Canal operates on a fresh water supply which mainly comes from Lake Alajula and Lake Gatun. The lakes largely depend on rainfall in the region, so the operation of the Panama Canal also depends on that. Not long ago, a new gate system was installed that needs about 53 million gallons of water to operate. So if there's not enough rainfall, water supplies decrease and the gates can't function properly. And so in 2019, a severe drought began. Freshwater reserves in the lakes dropped to just 105 billion cubic feet, while the canal needed 185 billion cubic feet to operate. You see the problem, right? The year 2023 turned out to be one of the driest periods since 1950, which seriously affected the operation of the canal. As a result, management had to introduce those very restrictions on draft, meaning the depth the vessel can sit in the water and the number of ships that can pass through each day. To give you an idea of the difference, on average, 38 vessels pass through the canal each day. However, in November 2023, the number of daily transits dropped to 24. But as I said, the restrictions also affected the draft. So the ships that passed through the canal could carry fewer containers at a time, and the number of containers decreased by a whole 40%. Today, the Panama Canal is bouncing back and is nearly at its pre-drought capacity, but the damage has already been done. That wasn't exactly a nice experience for the ship owners, so they're thinking, is there really no other reasonable alternative? Actually, the Panama Canal could have gained a competitor. In the early 1900s, the U.S. had two options: build a canal through Nicaragua or through Panama. At that time, the U.S. Senate decided on Panama because it was a relatively simple choice. The route was shorter, and unlike Nicaragua, there wasn't a chain of active volcanoes to deal with. Nobody wants to send their ships where there's a risk of eruptions. Just 10 years ago, a Chinese businessman came up with a grand project proposing to build such a canal by the end of the 2010s. Despite the hype, it never got off the ground. From a technical standpoint, building the Nicaraguan canal is quite possible. The only issue is that the distances that need to be covered for this are significantly greater than those of the Panama Canal. Any similar route will likely take the form of two channels connecting Lake Nicaragua to the Pacific Ocean on the west and the Atlantic Ocean on the east. According to rough estimates, one of these channels should be about 15.5 miles long, and the other, connecting to the Atlantic, should be even longer, about 62 miles. For comparison, the total length of the Panama Canal is 51 miles, because it sits at the narrowest point separating the Pacific Ocean from the Caribbean Sea. There's simply no better place. But since the Panama Canal has stopped meeting humanity's needs, something new needs to be created, even if that new thing costs at least $40 billion. A lot of people have really thought about how wise it is for such a huge amount of cargo to depend on one single place. And this dependence has continued since the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914. It plays a vital role in world trade. It's estimated that an average of 2.5% of global maritime trade passes through its locks each year. In 2023, it was expected that over 14,000 ships would go through it, but delays have, of course, significantly disrupted all plans. But wouldn't it be smarter to create several places like the Panama Canal to safely transport goods from one ocean to another? And if there's a problem at one spot, there will always be a reliable alternative. And you know, it looks like there's a solution. In Mexico. Because Mexico is already building the so-called Interoceanic Corridor Railway, which in the near future is expected to compete with the Panama Canal and facilitate international trade. Of course, they're really talking about reducing the load on the canal and all that stuff, but it's clear that the route will create competition where it hasn't existed since 1914. It's planned that a railway costing $7.5 billion will stretch for 188 miles across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. It also usually serves as the northern border of Central America. Hold on a second, what do gigantic ships have to do with railways? How can one take the place of the other? Actually, it's pretty simple. The railroad will move containers from ships to trains and transport them to vessels on the other side of the continent, where other ships will pick them up. The Mexican government has already invested $6 billion in this project, and about $2 billion has come from foreign investors. Overall, everything looks promising. They're building this railway in the thinnest section of Mexico between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. As I already said, it'll be a strip of land 188 miles long that'll connect the ports of Salina Cruz and Oaxaca with Coatzacoalcos in Veracruz. It's planned that this stretch of land will include 2 deep-water ports, railways, highways, 3 airports right away, Minatitlan, Ixtepec, and Huatulco, as well as a gas pipeline and a fiber optic network. The plans are so serious that there's almost a train schedule, where they're planning to run 31,111 trains a year with 45 cars each, 85 trains a day every 17 minutes. Yep, it's that well planned. And if Mexico manages to pull off this mega project, it'll revolutionize global trade routes. Plus, it'll help Mexico strengthen its position as a key player in international trade. Can you imagine how much money is involved? Which country would turn that down? And you might wonder, if the railway is such a cool idea, why didn't Mexico put it together earlier? After all, people have been riding trains for a few centuries. The answer's straightforward. It's all about the Panama Canal. That's what caused the first failure in the history of the Mexican corridor. Plans to connect 2 oceans through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec existed all the way back in the colonial period in the 16th century. Over time, there were ideas to dig a canal or build a highway in this spot, but those ideas never really got off the ground. So now they've launched a new project. Well, not exactly new. Actually, it's more like a revival of an old one, since the railroad here was built for similar purposes and even opened in 1907, but then it was just abandoned after the Panama Canal went into operation. But it seems that he who laughs last laughs best, and Mexico will definitely benefit if it can pull off everything it has planned, at least because this corridor will help in the fight against poverty. The railway will run through the Mexican states of Veracruz and Oaxaca, where you'll find some of the worst wealth stats. Here, on this map, you can see the states of Mexico marked with the level of overall poverty. Oaxaca and Veracruz are feeling not so great. Such a gap in living standards between regions is the result of some states having better infrastructure than others. At the same time, the poorest states have the largest number of indigenous people living there. It's a really sad situation, and it hasn't changed for several decades now. But the construction of the Interoceanic Corridor could finally get the ball rolling and bring the funding needed for infrastructure improvements to the poor states. Then it'll be about improving living standards and everything that comes with it. And by the way, this route is set to carry passengers as well. The train will have 10 stops in both states, with the ports on the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So people will be able to spend money in the poorer states, helping to improve the situation. As part of a project in the region adjacent to the train tracks, they're planning to create 10 industrial parks to promote economic investments and industrial development. For those who don't know, an industrial park is a specially designated area where you can build various businesses, thus saving on infrastructure and other stuff. Kind of like a dormitory for companies. So the plan is to have 10 of these parks for the electrical, electronic, automotive, transportation, pharmaceutical, and petrochemical sectors. It'll only get better. If everything goes according to plan, by 2050, the corridor project will account for 1.6% of the national GDP, pull in $50 billion in investments, and create 550,000 jobs in industrial parks. This will boost the quality of life for communities, giving them access to services and economic opportunities. And everyone will probably be way happier than they are now. But can the Interoceanic Corridor really compete with the Panama Canal? I mean, it's clear that with it in place, companies could potentially avoid dealing with the worsening conditions around the canal, but it's not clear if the Interoceanic Corridor will be faster, since loading and unloading ships and trains also takes time, and quite a bit of it. The key question, and the only thing that really matters, will the new route be more profitable for companies in the freight transportation business? Well, for now, we can only think about it theoretically. The length of the Panama Canal is 51 miles. The Mexican corridor is 188 miles. It takes about 8 to 10 hours to cross the Panama Canal. The route through the Mexican corridor is supposed to take 7 hours. Well, that's just the journey from port to port, not counting the unloading and loading of containers. If you include all those operations, the time increases to about 15 hours. On the other hand, as we've already figured out in the case of the Panama Canal, 8 to 10 hours can turn into 300 to 500 hours and even longer. So what does it come down to? You can see the days and distance saved thanks to the Interoceanic Corridor. You can pause and take a closer look. Some experts also believe that once it's up and running, the corridor will not only be a faster way to deliver goods, but also cheaper. The Panama Canal just offers a passage, while the Mexican corridor provides a passage along with a ton of bonuses. For instance, goods can be unloaded at one of the ports and processed further at one of the 10 major industrial centers lined up along the corridor. These are just awesome conditions. But there's one huge problem. Even if the Mexican corridor reaches its full potential, it can only handle up to 5% of the global trade that passes through the Panama Canal. At its peak activity, the Mexican corridor will be able to transport approximately 1.4 million containers annually. Meanwhile, the capacity of the Panama Canal is 8.3 to 8.5 million containers a year. The difference is noticeable, but that's because the Mexican corridor was never intended to be a full-on competitor to the Panama Canal, let alone a complete replacement. No matter how you look at it, it just can't take all the cargo ships away from the Panama Canal. Its goal is just to ease some of the traffic in the Panama Canal and, of course, to snag at least a small piece of the profits that Mexico really needs. Besides, Panama won't lose anything from this. In 2023, the Panama Canal's income increased by 14.9%, even with transit limitations, reaching $4.97 billion. Even 5% of this amount's a lot of cash, and it could make a real difference in the country's economy, especially for the poorest states. Here's what the former president of Mexico, López Obrador, said at his inauguration. Panama is already saturated, and we do not want to compete with our Panamanian brothers, whom we respect very much. We love very much. It's about having other options, and there are possibilities because, I repeat, trade in Asia has grown a lot. Trade volumes have indeed gone up, and when the Panama Canal was built, no one even thought about the future humanity would face. So there's nothing wrong with lending a hand and taking on some of the load, right? So if Mexico wishes some harm on the Panama Canal, no one will admit it. However, if the canal suddenly disappears, part of the goods, along with the profits, will go through the Mexican corridor, at least until someone comes up with another reliable alternative route. But really, the Panama Canal could definitely work together with the Mexican corridor. For example, they might share data and even reroute ships from the canal to the corridor, or the other way around if things get too busy. Or, if problems come up, like droughts that stop 60% of the cargo from being delivered. Yeah, in general, instead of a rivalry, both projects could work together and make the path from one ocean to another way better. Enhance logistics there, support the region. You get what I mean. And then I thought, why a railroad? Why not dig another canal there? It'd eliminate the need to unload ships and transport goods overland, only to load them onto another vessel again. It would save a ton of time. So in theory, you can dig another canal, but the cost of implementing this idea would be way too high. The distance of 300 miles overland between the oceans is almost 6 times longer than the Panama Canal. There's also the Suez Canal, which is longer at 118 miles, but the Suez Canal was dug through a flat desert, while the Mexican corridor goes through mountains, jungles, and also crosses the territory of many tribes, communities, and municipalities with different customs and interests in regional development. For ships to cross the Tehuantepec Isthmus, they would have to rise 10 times more than in the case of the Panama Canal. And don't forget that the construction of the Panama Canal is considered an engineering marvel for which many people paid with their lives. It wasn't easy, and building an even longer canal, even with modern technology, would still be a serious challenge. There's no guarantee that humanity's ready for it at all. So let's focus on the Mexican corridor. By March 21, 2023, the restoration of the railroad connecting Oaxaca and Veracruz was 79% complete. The passenger lines are ready or almost ready, while the freight ones have been pushed back a couple of times. Basically, to sum it all up, the preparation of the lines is still ongoing. The final work is scheduled for December 2025, and it seems like the project will end up costing twice the initial budget, mostly because of the landscape with its steep hills and curves through the mountains. These natural barriers restrict train movement and freight transport capabilities. Something needs to be done about these barriers, and that something costs money. But the builders aren't giving up. By 2028, 300,000 shipping containers will be transported annually through the interoceanic corridor, and by 2033, that number will reach 1.4 million. And then, 10 years from now, we'll truly be able to compare the Mexican corridor with the Panama Canal. People object. As is often the case, to bring a major project to life, authorities designate certain areas. But you can't just find an empty piece of land. Usually, people live everywhere, even if it's just a little. This is true for our railway as well. The construction project raises concerns because of possible land takeovers. Critics claim that it's not just about building transport routes, but also a plan to take land for various industrial facilities, including pipelines, factories, and industrial parks, as I've already said. Because of this, 32 communities which consider this territory their home are opposing the construction. Who would be okay with that anyway? In total, 11 indigenous peoples live here, along with Afro-Mexicans and mestizos who have communal lands. These lands are a treasure trove of unique traditions, including crafts, poetry, and dances. Additionally, the region is rich in diverse ecosystems, with many species of animals and birds living on these lands. Plants, by the way, will probably not be uprooted like people. The wildlife will just be wiped out. But regardless of that, the planners insist that railways are essential. Money, growth, modernization, fighting poverty. And as always, there's no simple answer to who's right. Mayan train. As you can see, the government's making every effort to ensure that Mexico's railway infrastructure meets the highest standards. The Mayan train project from Alstom will be a key event in the development of the country's railroads. It's expected to boost economic growth in the southeast of Mexico, creating jobs and supporting local production. 4,000 people will get jobs, plus 7,500 indirect jobs will be created. On top of that, the Mayan train will help preserve nature and promote sustainable tourism. It even aims to protect the cultural heritage of the region's indigenous people. In short, just good things, nothing bad. A project worth $1 billion includes the design, production, and supply of 42 extrapolis trains, along with the creation of the needed rail systems, workshops, and depots. It's said that these trains blend modern technology, competitiveness, and reliability that have been tested in other models. Furthermore, each train is one of a kind. Its colors and designs represent local art. It all sounds really lovely. I'd love to take a ride. Well, you owe me something. I'm talking about a like in case you didn't get it. See you later.